Sorry. Okay, first of all, just like a quick like a baseline assessment. How many of you have been involved in fundraising efforts, either by projects or by directly fundraising, or how many have you directly an experience of fundraising? The museum has? Okay, so it's a mixed group. Some of you have had this experience, some of you have not. Of course, whatever work we are doing as a think tank, it is important to understand what level of what are the sources of fundraising and where the sources are coming from, and then how sustainable is the funding mechanism for a think tank is, and then how do we hold ourselves accountable to the funders, and what is the mechanism in place. So this is somewhat also related to our earlier session on the governance, and so we'll talk about that in a moment. Again, this may be more relevant to a think tank which is in foundation stages, which is sort of when we are setting up of a new think tank. But it is also applicable in a way if an existing think tank is embarking on a new program or a new project, a new initiative which is likely to last a bit more time, like not maybe 3 months or 6 months, but maybe a multi-year project. And some of the very basic questions we need to begin with is, how much is needed, how much financial resources are needed to start a project or to start a think tank. In this perspective, what is important is not just our I would say organizational needs. So some of the needs would be relevant with the staffing requirement, with having an office, with running an operation, with the logistics, but also some of that will be related with the requirement of engaging outside researchers. Sometimes you are hiring consultants, you are hiring the other experts who are not your staff. When we are starting a think tank, I have often seen that we become very ambitious. We may be talking about, let's say, a single project. We may be talking about 1 year of funding, which is in our hand, and then we want to jump into that project or a think tank. And sometimes once we create that project, once we create that infrastructure, especially if it's a new think tank, then it becomes almost very important for us to sustain that organization. And we are not looking for funds just to sort of keep consistent with the mission, but we are seeking for more funds for just sustaining the organization. So at what point do we actually start the think tank, or do we actually start the project? So a good way is to avoid the risks of starting with the low level of funds, and to make sure that you have either a multi-year of funding available, or some multiple projects which are there to support the organization in initial couple of years. In this case, we need to identify very initially who are the potential funders, who can come from your local sources, also come from international community. And then important thing is that, again, this is about talking about your mission and the alignment with the mission with the outside world, which is in this case just the funders. for instance, SITE has been supporting the network of think tanks for a couple of years now. Now, SITE obviously comes with a focus on market economy, with a focus on the role of the private sector, with also pro-democratic voices. So, what is normally, I think John would agree that what we normally expect is that think tanks, partner think tanks, would also have similar views, similar priorities in terms of the project, in terms of the position. But at the same time, it is very important to sort of create a distinction that the organization itself is independent. This is not, we're not talking about a relationship where we are outsourcing a particular work. No funder, I think no international funder would like that kind of association. It's mostly in terms of the partnership, it's mostly in terms of the alignment between what an individual is already thinking about a particular problem and what kind of projects are needed to support that work. And so that alignment is crucial, and a realistic estimate of the availability of funding and funding partners is crucial. I don't know how many of us can say that we are using all or many kind of all the different kind of sources of funds. But let me ask quickly, like, what sources of fundraising, let's just say VEPR is involved in out of these? By general grants, let me explain. By general grants, I mean institutional grants, which are not tied to projects, which are given to sustain an organization. Could be sustain an HR office, but they are not related with projects. Project is obviously related with specific projects. Event fees, so can be participation fees in programs and conferences, publication sales, when you are selling your own products, if you're doing a training, if you're providing some kind of consultancies, services. These are all kind of various sources of funding which as a think tank you can rely on. And this, I'm assuming that here we're talking about think tanks which are operating relatively independent of the government. So when it comes to the government-related think tanks, obviously it's a very different ball game, but here we're talking about relatively independent think tanks. So a think tank would depend on some or combination of these sources.
If VPR, the main source of fund is the project grants. Yeah.
Project grants. Okay.
Yes. We don't have general grants, and we do publication. So, but it doesn't count a lot in our budget. But yes, publication phase sales. Yes.
Okay.
Certain level.
Would you like to share about lead experience and which kind of funding?
I think based on our experience, I mean the lead organization itself, because I mean we have some sort of problem in terms of this actually, but then we use because we did some translation, and based on the book sale, then we use for our funding. That's one. And the second is for the training fees, because we did a lot of trainings. For instance, like freedom schools, we have the lead school of public policy. So based on the fees, we use as a part of our fundraising tool. All right, thank you.
We do mainly project grants also, but because we also have because we work on the media, so we have training and and consultancy fee also. So we are giving trainings or consult to other organization or network, and through that they will contribute to some of their money for us. And also sometimes we are publications about media project or maybe some research regarding this, and we are selling those. And also one more thing is we have social fundraising. So this is when some people are interested in our work, they will give us money for runnings for free. So they're giving they support it other ways.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other examples of fundraising sources of funding?
Now we are only doing project grants also, because regarding to the events fee and training fee, we are working on it. And publication, we do lots of publication, but not for sale yet.
Yeah. I just want to add, okay, we'll come back to.
I mean, this is not the lead experience, but I experienced myself during my previous works in another organization. So we had dinner, fundraising dinner. Okay, we had a fundraising dinner, which is we have a targeted people, stakeholders, and we also sell it to the people who are interested to fund our events or organization. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other additions?
I think not different from others. Like for us, the main source is project grants, but we also have consultancy fee for small projects. But I'm wondering the general grants, because like you said, it for general support for the organization, and we have never had one.
Yeah, that's right. Any other sources which have not been mentioned here? On the other side. Okay, thank you.
Actually, most of our fund come from project grants. We do not commercialize publication sale, but we have some funding for training courses, for short courses, and we also do have some consultancy fee, but it's very small.
Yeah. Great. Any other points here? So I think the main discussion, perhaps the avenue of. Would you like to add something? No, I don't. Okay. The main, of course, driving factors of many of the think tanks is the project grant, which is also true with ideas. But in different contexts, when we talk especially about the general grants, we're talking about potentially a membership base, which can be explored in certain countries. There is a community of sponsors, individuals, funders who agree to, let's say, 10 or 15 people who agree to contribute to the foundation of the organization, and that can help in actually sustaining the organization beyond the projects. Because although we all depend mostly on the projects, but we know that a limitation of the project is the project life cycle. And if the project life, let's say, sometimes project life cycle can be 6 months, can be 3 years, it varies. But typically, project means, of course, there is a start and there is an end. And if project A is different from project B, and project B is different from project C, then each time we are sort of we have to reinvent the systems and bring new skill set if they are not related. So, and that creates, in general, in all think tanks, and of course ideas is a part of it, a sort of a dependency on the project life cycle. And because we don't have either what I call a product, for instance, a product which we can sort of package and we can repeat and we can sell at multiple level, and so we are always dependent on the project itself, and that is also that becomes a weakness eventually in the long run if the think tank is not able to produce a sort of a local network either of companies or individuals who are able to support some level of general function. So let's say if the budget of the organization is 100,000 US dollar, some part of it is coming from the fixed operations, the minimum staff, but some is related with the project. So that I would say that at least that fixed cost, that minimum organizational capital should be able to be funded from non-project sources to have some kind of sustainability. Otherwise, in most of the cases, think tanks do have limited life, and they, unless there's a university or government backing, then they often face challenge in the continuation of the think tanks. Although, yeah, please.
I mean, the ideal scenario, which is not possible for most organizations, but there are certainly two in PNG that I've been involved with. It's run like a university that has had hundreds of years of alumni making contributions. It's not possible for most, but I do. Yeah, these two entities, and one of them is actually the Transparency International chapter in PNG, with their Walk Against Corruption every year. It's built up a lot of money, which goes into an endowment fund, and then with that endowment fund, they were actually able to buy a property. That reduces their overall costs, and it's got a little sub-property on the back, which actually gets them some rental. So, and there's another one which I was involved in. It also managed to acquire a little block of land, and then was able to get a grantor to provide a counterpart contribution. And again, it's got a little guest house on there, which is useful for training courses and is then used by others. So it's a sustainable revenue source. So, like with many civil society organizations, the revenue flows are very undulating, and sometimes people have to really tighten their belt during the downturn. It helps to carry, provide sustainability and
No, I mean, just 2 years ago, Ideas also relatively well established. 2 years ago, Ideas had a serious financial crunch. Two of our major financial international donors pulled out or decided to cancel the project. One was related with the political change at the host country, nothing which could be controlled domestically, and nothing which could have been sort of predicted. And so when you are dependent on project flows, and especially if, let's say, 2 or 3 of your projects are more than 50% of your budget, and something happens like that, then you are in serious trouble. And if you recall, there was also a public appeal went out from Ideas that Ideas is going to close down, because it had some following, it influenced some people, and so there was some support available. So eventually, some level of support from our general funders was mobilized when the project funding got dry, and that helps us really in the short term before we could regroup ourselves. And then we also had a change in our strategy. So for instance, like I think most of us, we were dependent on the international project grants. But then we started, after that crisis, I would say, we started looking for like local private sector companies who also had issues with certain parts of economic policy. So we thought, okay, if there is interest in a local private sector company, a commercial company, in talking about let's say new set of regulations, and if it is consistent with our view of that regulation, then maybe there's a good chance for getting a research grant from that company. Now,
sounds like a going out a business sale when you announce that ideas may have to shut down. General
Yes.
funds come in. It's like stores that are going out of business. Everything must go. That's
Everything must go. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
boosting your sales.
yeah, there was a difference of opinion within ourselves. I mean, I was not CEO, but there was a difference between whether such a call should be made or not, even in the first place. But eventually, the call was made, and gave a sort of like a SOS call. But in generally, then we had a different strategy. We said, okay, let's look out for the private sector capital. Malaysia is relatively well developed, advanced, not a developed, but relatively upper middle income country. So therefore, we should have those companies. And the response was quite positive, actually. Tricky thing for us was how to manage these new funders from the private sector, who are not really looking for. This is not a CSR money, right? So we are not providing schools. I mean, we have a different project in which we do actually run a couple of schools, but that's a different thing. For the policy work, there is no grassroots benefit, so people don't see that benefit directly. And to differentiate that funding and to sort of insulate that funding from the influence on the research. This typically happens when you work with the private sector. I mean, it also happens, of course, with any kind of funded research. But I think with the private sector commercial funded research, it is more difficult to manage because they have a bottom line to report to, and if they don't see that the research of any particular research is not helped them, then of course they are also accountable to their shareholders. So it's a difficult line to walk and to sort of, but I think that is where we have employed a very careful editorial independence strategy, and the funders, the private sector funders, have largely appreciated the work because of that independence. If they are supporting, and this is all very transparent by the way, so today you can go on our website, click the funders, and you can see the names of all the funders, private sector, international, whoever. So this is very, very transparent, and they appreciate that we are not hiring a lobbyist, we are not hiring a PR company. We are supporting a think tank which has similar set of views on a particular problem or policy, and therefore what you are doing is essentially you are diversifying. Diversification of these resources is important to manage through the risks which many of the organizations, especially those who are not well established, is important. So I would definitely encourage us all to think about how well spread we are, and even if we are all dependent on the projects, are we all dependent on international, or we are diverse, like a local funding sources and international funding sources. I mean, I can say with some degree of confidence that right now we are diverse in that sense, but that's again that's not an option for each country we operate in. And in many countries, private sector is not that sophisticated to come up to terms with the independent think tank, independent policy advice, and there's a degree of crudeness there which we have to fight. So,
sorry, just a question. When they make the contributions to ideas, does that go down under in their own corporate books? Does that go down as public relations, or is it recorded as research? How do they record it? Charitable donations.
Yeah, that varies from the companies to companies. I mean, I've not looked back to their accounts in that sense, but normally it is a part of I think the government and public affairs. So when we are interacting with the counterpart in the private sector, we are mostly dealing with the public affairs.
Is that determined by the legal status of what the think tank is? Like if it's in the US, it's called a 501c3. It's an organization, which basically it's a non-profit charitable organization site is technically a 501c3.
Right.
So we don't get that many private donations, but they're then, in the US, tax deductible. Whereas the US Chamber of Commerce is what's known as a 501c4. So it's not a charity, but businesses can still write off the contribution as a business expense.
I see.
So is it,
Yeah.
I guess that varies from country to
Yeah.
country, but it probably just depends on what the corporate status of the recipient entity is, as to how it will be recorded. By
Yeah,
the donor.
it's in Malaysia that getting tax exemption is very hard. It involves like a highest level of the government offices to agree, like Minister of Finance, for instance. Minister of Finance has to agree to an applicant to give this degree. So we are not a tax exempt. For a corporate funder, we are a business expense. Giving us a check would count to business expense, which is not tax exempt. So that actually sometimes reduces our ability to get that kind of funding, because they would also look for these benefits. But since we are not tax exempt, I think what we found is more helpful to talk about very specific topics on which we can do research, so that it is aligned with the business objective of a company and the view which the think tank is advocating.
We have. Sorry.
Just a quick question to some of the partners and think tank partners, and maybe this is something that in the discussion Anne can also help address, or some of you can help address, depending on your maturity and as far as fundraising is concerned. What are the common issues you encounter in doing your fundraising work, or even looking at the sustainability of your financial activities in relation to the operations of the think tank? I'm curious to find out as far as issues that you might encounter, you have encountered in the past, and maybe you could share as well in as far as the other partners are concerned. If you have best practices, that'll be interesting. Of course, ideas, Ali would personally, I think, have a lot of best practices to share, and this would be opportunity for us to also learn about some of the issues and problems you encounter, and how we can look at the different perspectives in as far as fundraising is concerned. One of the issues that I always felt was relevant to be underscored is that most of the time, as Ali mentioned earlier, I think in the discussion earlier, everything is tied up to just a project. And after the project is finished, you look for the next project that could help sustain, and there's no financial plan on board that could really help underscore that sustainability path that you're looking at. And maybe this is something that I think some of us can share some issues and examples of how to help address that cycle, or get out of that cycle, and making more relevant activities that are sustainable enough to create that leverage as far as financial program is concerned.
So, question is that what kind of issues do we face in fundraising? Okay, this is a good question, and maybe others can answer. I'll just put it here. Issues in fundraising. No issues. Always funds available.
Always.
It's a big issue, I think.
Then can you give one or two quick examples? Like what is your major challenge there?
So I mean the question, Ryan's question is a big issue for our fund problem. For us, we haven't faced this problem, but I agree with Ryan about that. In terms of practice, so although our budget come almost from projects, but we have annual and periodical, so reports and products, and that receive quite constant funding from other organizations and donors. So it can be seen as a quite permanent and constant funding for us. Yeah.
So I think there's like two problems. I think one is the engagement and the second one is the involvement of the funder. So the engagement is like how long will they work with us? How far will they want to go with us in the long-term futures? So when we try to face this problem, we actually are looking for the previous previous grant that they already support. So with other partners, like in terms of when they work with other partners, like do they work with them long term or just one project and then it ends? So we look at this, and the other one was the involvement. So how will they change our views or try to influence us in some ways? Some investment not really trying to put some of their opinion to us, like that. They impose or input the ideas of them. So sometimes it's kind of hard because maybe at this moment we have to see that is this idea actually good with it or will it impact it in a negative ways. So we have to face it and have to analyze it. So it's gonna take a time.
Okay.
So
anything which you'd like to add? Okay. Anything would you like to add, please? Like issues with the funding, the challenges.
Yes, I was asking actually some friends in some Middle Eastern think tanks and related entities, and how many of yours are actually locally funded by private sector or funded? They said, oh, none of them. We're all funded by French aid, German aid, British aid, whatever. Okay, so. There is some, I don't know if any of you are fortunate enough to have been funded by an entity called the Think Tank Initiative, which has funded, I remember I was in Delhi one time and I was trying to see if we could, I talked to IDRC, the Canadian body, and they said, oh, we're funding, and it's particularly Canadian money, but some British, some German, Norwegian, whatever funds. And they said, oh, we're funding things across Africa, across Asia and across South America. We're not going to do the Pacific because Australia's there, so it can fund things there. But those that they were funding had like a 10-year stream of funding support. I mean, we'd all dream of something like a 10-year funding support because most of us live with little short-term interventions if we project funding or maybe some sort of other grant funding or whatever, but they were providing funding for 10 year and they've just completed their review of their 10 year because it's just completed this year. I don't know what's happened to the 40 something institutions, more than 40 institutions they've been supporting. There's suddenly they're all going to find that they've run out of those funds. But yeah, I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary, but what the end result was, look, they were funding, some were well-resourced, some were marginal, and some were very weak-resourced. At the end of the 10 years, they said the well-resourced were still well-resourced, the middle-resourced were still middle-resourced, and the marginal are still marginal.
Oh, I see. That's not a very encouraging...
But they said, no, they'd done some wonderful work, but yeah, they hadn't really been able to help them to become more sustainable or more. They had helped them to do some wonderful work. They'd enabled many of them to actually upgrade the salaries and to be able to attract some, additional really good researchers and so on. But they hadn't been able to enable them to be on a more sustainable funding at the end of the 10 years. They still were looking for an ideal situation that someone would come along and offer them 10 years of support. But, anyway.
Sustainability.
Look up their final report. It's got some interesting, what it did say to donors was don't try to double think the think tanks. They know themselves better than anyone else. Don't try and say, we will fund you for this level of technical support or this level of research or this level of educational support for your staff. Let the think tanks do their own thinking and tell you what they want.
Any other would like to share? Okay. Challenges and issues in fundraising?
Yes. this is a kind of general issue. In Indonesia, the big challenge, one of the big challenges in fundraising is charity is not popular in Indonesia. I think the problem is being too religious. The rich persons in Indonesia prefer to give money for mosque or other kind of. That is not popular like how Bill Gates give his money for charity. So that can be a project of think tank, how to raise awareness of people to give a charity for the think tank, I think.
And even actually, this is often talked about, but even, I mean, many years ago when I took part in this training program called Think Tank MBA, which is run by Atlas Network. So one of our resource person who runs a successful think tank in Canada mentions about the charity and mentions about, I still remember the statistic which he quoted, that even in North American context, which is where we have those individuals like, Cato Institute, they have big funders, but they also have 50,000 people who are donating maybe $10 to $500. So that creates a certain degree of independence and ownership in the society. But even in North American context, this kind of giving for think tanks, if you look at the overall charity in, let's say, US society, was maybe about 1%. So not a lot. So think tanks do not appear high on priority on general funders, individual charitable individuals or organizations. This is the universal case. But even that 1% is good enough to fund a good number of think tanks, because most of us are operating on shoestring budgets. We are not a very sort of multi-million-dollar entities, right? And we do not need that kind of budget, to be honest. What we need is a small budget, but with budget which can be programmed, and a budget with clear set of objectives which can be reasonably predicted, and on which we can do something, let's say, over years. And so often it is important to have a plan in mind, and that is perhaps the last point before we break. I understand, Ryan, we are already discussing this best practices thing, so we don't need to that as a session, right? So after that we'll go for lunch. Oh, sorry, I missed that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. I think in terms of fundraising, I think the resources from government or NGO are now very limited. So we are looking for the fund from company as well. For example, recently we tried to do some research on policy, public policy that regarding that affecting the business environment. Under the industrial generation for some companies in Vietnam, and I think looking for fund for companies is very good for think tank, because we can do the policy, we can review and evaluate policy, and we can give recommendation for the government to change the business environment, and that's good for companies, and a lot of companies care about that.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Private sector funding is important. So the question really is, which also Paul mentioned about, how do we know that we are sustainable or not, right? So what metrics can we use, what indicators, what can be used? So for instance, are we sustainable if we have cash for 1 year? How many of you would say that? I would say that. We have a line of funders available, not 1 or 2, but 5 or 7. Dependable funders who can approach to multi-year projects. We have products. By products I mean the training, publications which are repeatable, not projects which are not often repeatable. Or we have a plan. Like to point out this last point here more often. Oops, I pushed the wrong button here. Okay, it's back. Great. So I think all of these points are helpful indicators for sustainability. From, let's say, lower level of just having the cash, to funders, to projects, to products, to a plan. So ultimately it's all about leads to a plan. Do we have a plan? Having written 1 proposal or 2 proposals, even winning the proposals grant in terms of grants is not a plan. Plan is that, okay, what is think tank want to achieve in terms of the objectives, what is the audience we have, what kind of funding resources are available and where they will come from, and then of course implementing, refining their plan over time, and that is, I think, most crucial aspect of sustainability. If we don't have a plan and we still have other sources, that may still not be enough. So having plan is, in my opinion, most important indicator of a sustainable organism. Of course, then we talk about what kind of plan and quality. Will not go into that aspect right now. And my really last point of this presentation is that the complex environment in which think tanks operate is this multi-layers of accountability, which makes our life just a little bit more complicated. We don't have just a board to report to. Sometimes you can say board is also part of think tank, but here I'm talking about management, the staff, the team which runs the projects. But also we are accountable to regulators, over registration authorities of the government, then the funders, of course, and then the audience. Sometimes the regulators are helpful, allow the think tank activities to perform. Sometimes there is a conflict between regulator and some funders. So for instance, some Western foundations are not welcome in countries which are not necessarily very democratic. So there's a concern about the existence of think tanks and the sustainability of think tanks in these jurisdictions. But the complex levels of accountability needs to be maintained in terms of the funding, in terms of the transparency, and in terms of our reporting requirements. This also needs systems to be in place within the think tanks by setting up processes and mechanism at the board level, but also through reporting. We know that some funders can be very demanding. SIPE is not one of them in terms of the reporting. Like all these sheets of reports, is more driven by output. Some of the funders can be very demanding in terms of like actual timelines, and that can be complicated. That can be a big claim on the organized resources. But nevertheless, I think what is often, I would say, not so desirable and even tragic at times, where a think tank is ultimately accountable, practically most of the time thinking about funders' accountability, and not much here to the audience. If the audience is public, if the audience is the members of the government, or members of the cabinet, media, etc., in the project life cycle, we are all too busy thinking about them. And what is important is to maintain a balance. We are, of course, accountable for the use of money to the government regulations, to the funders. But then what we are giving back to the society is also very important. And maintaining that level of accountability is crucial. So we stop.